so it was a little bit of a long trip down. I will speak up. It's not my nature. I'm sort of soft-spoken, but I will project for you this evening, and in more than one way. So maybe we can inch this more towards. It's going to be presentational. I have things to show you, but we can inch it towards a conversation. If you have something that comes up that I show you that you have a question about, raise your hand, and we can maybe engage in that way. That way we'll consume that question and answer session at the end and maybe weave it into the actual talk. But if it's okay, I'd like to show you a few slides. There's one. That's another one, and I love that one. It's my favorite. All right. So that sort of gives you the impression that I'm not really here I'm not here to be heavy. I'm just here to talk about some work that I've done over the course of the last few years. I ran into a DJ who worked at a gas station, and I used to go there late nights, and eventually he invited me to his apartment, this guy who worked at the gas station. And I didn't go to his apartment. Well, he invited me to a party. I didn't go to the party. And then later on, I went to the gas station again. He invited me to his apartment, and I thought, well, obviously there's something he wants me to see. So I went to his apartment, and when I walked in, he had 2 turntables, a mixer, and about 8 or 9 crates of records on the floor. And he proceeded to show me how to DJ. And he was a DJ from Chicago. This is when I was living in Winona, Minnesota. And I was interested in hip-hop music at the time, and particularly fascinated with what DJs did and the scratching and everything. And I don't know if you've ever heard anyone attempt to DJ, but the first time they do it, it's never a pretty sight or a series of sounds. But for some reason, he gave me the key to his apartment and encouraged me to come any time to practice, and I took him up on it. So for about a month, I would enter this guy's apartment and go up the stairs and pull out these musty records and then figure out what this craft was all about. And then I went to school and sort of immediately got a job as a DJ in the local sort of campus nightclub, which was an old renovated pool. And in daytime it was a study hall. So I would go there with the key and open up the cabinets and put the turntables on the floor, and while everybody else was studying their topics, I was studying the turntables. And I eventually ended up joining a band and then moved up to Minneapolis where I was in a band, and it was basically, I was using the turntable and trying to make it transparent. I was using samples of saxophones and pianos and birds and trumpets so that it didn't sound like the typical scratching or DJing that you might hear, but you might hear a recontextualized trumpet solo coming from the turntable. And then after I left that group, I started to improvise with cellists and spoken word artists and dancers. And when I played with other live musicians, I was really envious of their ability to hit something and get a sound, or pluck a string and get a sound. And I started to try to instrumentalize the turntable by doing that myself. I'd actually turn the volume up as high as I could, and the whole turntable would be sensitive to any sort of vibration, so you could play it with chopsticks so that you wouldn't destroy it, and you could play different parts and build a sort of textural map of sounds. Like if you hit the end of the tone arm up there, you could get, I have a little pointer here, up here, you could get these beautiful bass note sounds, and if you hit here, you'd get a snare. And these platters are so finely turned that you could even take them off and use them as a gong. So I was trying to find ways of creating physical sound with the record. And one day I was doing this, playing it like a drum with chopsticks, and I took a tin can and I put it up against the cartridge, and I hit the tin can just expecting to hear a thud like I would normally, but the tone of the can rang through and was amplified by the turntable. The actual note was amplified, and that was my eureka moment when I realized that the turntable was capable of transmitting both notes as well as just these sort of textural percussive sounds. And so I came up with something called a stylophone, which is basically a stick from the first stretcher I ever made to paint on when I was in art school, with a piece of fishing line on it. And if you tuck the fishing line just underneath the needle, anything you do to the line will be amplified. And it was so sensitive you could even blow on it and it would turn into a wind instrument. I have a little video I can show you here of some of those early inventions. This is basically a cartridge with some fishing line on it. And then this is the stylophone I'm talking about. Bass version was about 3.5 feet long. That glove is something I actually built. I wanted to make a glove with a needle on each finger so you could play 4 different parts of the record at the same time. And I kept thinking you could make a record with maybe 8 bands of notes, so you could end up playing chords, melodies, and if the record sped up or slowed down, all the notes would increase and decrease in pitch at the same time as well. So I eventually ended up making that and using it for other sorts of applications, but I built multi-string stylophones and sort of extended this theme and made a lot of variations. And then one day I decided, well, why not just put the strings on the turntable itself? And I ended up drawing this instrument, which I later called a phonoharp. There's actually an old English zither type, auto harp type of instrument called a phonoharp. But I stuck to my guns and wanted to call it that, and after about a year, images of my instruments started to outpace the ones of the traditional phonoharp on Google Images, and I felt like I'd achieved something like that. But yeah, I called it a phonoharp, and basically when you pluck the strings, the vibrations are ferried into the body of the turntable and amplified when the needle's on the record. So records are basically these historical records. They store the information so that when you spin them, you can release it. But in this case, I'm actually using the record I'm using it in the traditional way, but I'm also using it as a direct physical medium for the vibrations to get into the stylus. So this was the resulting instrument built from that drawing. And then from then on, I had ideas for instruments all the time, and about 3 months over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 years, I would build another one. This one has little toothpicks that were cut in half and super glued down to the frets to be able to play notes. This is, after I'd built a certain number of them, I felt confident or comfortable enough to actually take my Technics 1200, which was my prized turntable, and chop it up and build something new out of it. And I built this steel-stringed phonoharp, and I ended up traveling quite a bit and using this sort of as my workhorse for many years. And maybe I should say a few things about why I even was fascinated with records, and I think it's because they're this physical artifact. You zoom all the way in on the grooves. There's little valleys and ridges that hold the information, and when you spin that record back, that snare drum is always at the same place. DJs you'll see have little tape marks on their records so they can reference that and play rhythms, and they know exactly where those sounds are. You can recover them with a cone of paper and a needle. It's like a physical thing, and they actually erode. Certain samples that I've used many, many times, you'll go back to it and you'll hear a wash of sound that builds up over it, like a wash of static, as the needle sort of erodes the surface of the hills and valleys of the record. And I think there's something about that immediacy and that physicalness that appealed to me as a maker. I was inspired by Tumani Diabate and other kora players, and I really wanted a kora, but I couldn't afford one, so I carved this bridge, and I carried it around for months until I had enough money to go to the flea market and pick up some secondhand turntables and materials, and I ended up building this kora, turntable kora. This is about 6 feet tall and this big around. Hard to move around, but beautiful to listen to, at least for me. I also was kind of fascinated by the conversation the last speaker about aesthetics and this notion of beauty. And for me, I find that if you make something beautifully, it tends to work beautifully, or at least it helps. So I think the reason is that if you spend the time and you apply the care that it takes to make something beautiful, that care is evident in the other things that you do to construct it. So somehow I was building a vocabulary, a visual vocabulary in working with wood. And mind you, I have no background in woodworking or electronics or even in music for that matter. I just have a background in trying things. And I've been fortunate that the things I've tried have borne fruit, and I've been able to work on it. It provided me with opportunities, and I've been able to work on more and more of these things that I'm compelled to do. This is actually a music box inspired turntable. That central cylinder can be reprogrammed, and when you play the records, the tines will pluck and it'll play strings, and you can have acoustic samples along with the samples that are on the record. And there are records that have circular grooves that'll play the same beat over and over again. And because it's physical, you can line it up with that instrument, and the sound of the record will actually be in time with what the instrument is playing. I went to a sarangi concert. It's a beautiful Indian instrument, and I ended up wanting to make a bowed turntable, and so this was my version of a bowed turntable. This was the bridge that I cut out for it, and it has 15 sympathetic strings, so when you're bowing the 3 main strings, there's a kind of shine sound that comes from the rest of them. As a result of doing this work, I got to meet David Harrington of the Kronos Quartet, and we thought for maybe about a year and a half we were trying to figure out a way to work together, and an opportunity came up, and Alice Wingwall, who's a board member and a friend of Kronos, commissioned me to do a piece in memory of her sister who passed away from ALS. So I wrote a piece called Cerulean Suite, and it was inspired by Mingus's music. It was about memory and loss, and I built instruments for them. First I wrote them the piece, they had it transcribed and performed it, and then I wrote myself into it, and we performed it together, and then I built them instruments for them to play it on. And as the piece progressed, they ended up getting further and further away from their original instruments and having to play these. This is a piece that I was working on.
We're not going to hear any of that?
Huh?
We're not going to hear some of it?
Cerulean Suite. It actually hasn't been published. I only have a few scratchy private recordings that actually I'd have to search out. Maybe I can send you one.
Do you have a picture of them playing your instruments?
I do, but it's not in this talk. This is a phonoharp that I decided to make because I was thinking, I've been on stage quite a bit at this point, and I was thinking about creating a gestural language as well as a musical one. So I installed little light sensors here, 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 and underneath here are motors that respond to the light sensors, and there are strings that float over these bridges. So you can gesture over the instrument, and it'll a drone of a particular chord will come on, and then you can play into that, gesture over another one, and also these 2 dots here and here control the forward and reverse of the record player itself. So if you waved your hand over the record would go, and you could actually control its speed. So I was working on this one, and I got a residency at the Science Center in Singapore, and ended up building them one of these for their exhibit floor. And you can see here, I'm a real lover of birds, and that language is starting to work its way into my instruments. But this is the one I built for the Singapore Science Center. It was exhibitized, so it was really just for people to be able to create sound by gesturing over it, but they couldn't really put their hands on it, which was a shame, but it's the nature of museum work. Here's another phonoharp that was a little bit more recent, maybe 4 years old. And you can see the birds are still finding their way into these forms. And I was thinking too about aesthetics, and when you're creating an instrument, people would ask me, like, how did you figure out the math for that particular instrument? And really what I did was I put a piece of wood out in front of me and I drew a shape that felt good. And then I built it and strung it up and tightened all the strings to a particular tension that sounded sonorous and nice, and then took out the tuner and figured out what that was and wrote it down, and then had to learn to play it. So I let the instruments tell me what they would become, and then I would sort of meet them halfway and then learn how to play the instruments. And there's that question of when is a curve just right? I find it fascinating because it could have to do with the conversation you had that morning, or the meal you just ate, or the week you've had. There's a certain point at which you draw the line and it just feels right. And I think I've been happy that I've been able to trust that, and it's been satisfying. Like I haven't had to CNC route everything or make everything perfect. There's actually, these instruments are built by cutting plywood in layers, and the jigsaw that I use will, the blade will bend. And so as you cut through, you get all of these imperfect, non-square edges. But if you trace the one you just cut, and then you trace the one you just cut, the errors propagate, and you end up with these beautiful organic shapes in the walls that you couldn't have planned out or made with any instrument that would cut straight edges. So there are some advantages to embracing the mistakes and the impreciseness of particular tools. I think there's a benefit to limiting your tools and figuring out how to stretch them, and then upgrading to other ones, because it's sometimes problematic when you have everything at your disposal when you start out. This is a great blue heron at the Golden Gate Bridge. Around the time I was doing all this, I was also fascinated, like I said, with birds, and walking around the city, I took these photographs. And these forms and shapes, I used to be able to not see them, but now that I've taken these photographs, I see these freeze frames when I see birds flying. That one's a little more grizzly. But so I was spending a lot of time outdoors and started to see everything as a turntable. Wheels on the bus that rolled by, or anything that spun or moved. I wanted to put a record on it and figure out how to use it. So I built this turntable, and it has soup ladles from Chinatown, and a lampshade frame, and a scooter rim, and you set it outside and it plays the record at the speed of whatever the wind is doing that day. So if it's a really windy day, it could be a 3-minute record. If it's really blustery, the record will change speeds. But part of this notion of partnering with nature is that I get to surrender control and then see what happens. And I'm much more interested in that than in knowing exactly what's going to happen, because then for me it just becomes manufacturing somehow. I really like to start processes that I don't know that I'm capable of. I feel like I'm capable of completing them, but I don't know how I'm going to do it, and I let the process inform me. This is an actual old belt drive from a turntable, but when inverted and stuck on a windmill, it'll generate enough electricity to power this platter in the back here. This is an idea for spool-powered turntables, where if you have a big spool of thread and you pull the string, you're going to spin the spool. And I started to think about different versions of this, like you could be at a picnic and have a spool turntable with you and release a boat into the creek next to you, and as it pulled the thread, it would play music, and the boat would go down the creek, and you could have your picnic, and it'd be lovely. And I thought about balloons as a way of doing that too, so I built this balloon-powered one, and it has a little speed governor on it and everything. And when you release the balloons, you have to wrangle them with one hand, and you wear the glove with the 4 needles on the other hand, and you're playing the record like this as the balloons go out the window. And it actually works. Here's the glove. It's actually just an old bicycle glove, and I realized that these cartridges work like little microphones, so they're fairly simple to wire up too. This is a fire-powered turntable. These are about $80 worth of cheap candles, and when you light them all, they generate enough heat, so if you give the record a push, it'll play for about 5 minutes. The problem is, the candles are so close to each other, they generate so much heat that they melt each other, and in 5 minutes they burn themselves all the way down to the ground, and you're out $80. So, it's a very expensive music player. It's only been played twice. I just couldn't afford it. This is an idea for an earthquake power turntable. These pendulums would actually swing when the ground moved, and that pendulous energy would be transferred into rotational energy, and it would play a song that I would never play for anyone, because the whole point is to wait. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that you want to test or share. Like the idea is to think back to a time when we really needed to pay attention to the cycles of the seasons, and waiting for the rains, or having a sense of time that's different from the accelerated sense that we all live with now, when we're behind 3 people at an ATM, or when we just got stopped by a red light. It feels like an infinity, but it's actually going to be maybe 18 seconds before you get to go again. So these were exercises in that kind of attention to time. This is a project that the Luggage Store Gallery allowed me to do. They've been trying to get rid of pigeons in their gallery for 3 years before that, and I showed up and said, I want to do a project that will invite the pigeons into your gallery. And for some reason they gave me the key, and they let me spend a month building this structure that I had the windows removed, and the pigeons would come in and land inside the structure. They'd be protected from the people in the gallery, and you could only view them through little peepholes. But they could act naturally and behave and do whatever they wanted to do. But in here, the little ledges were all weight sensitive, so when the birds would land on them, they would trigger turntables and sound elements inside the gallery. In here. And for 2 weeks, nothing happened, and everybody was saying, oh, you've got to change this, and this is too heavy, and you've got to make these adjustments. And 2 weeks, almost to the day, a pigeon just walked in there, and all of his friends showed up. And then for the next 2 weeks, at 1 o'clock, all the birds on Market Street, or many of the birds on Market Street, would fly in and fly right into the piece, and it would activate. It would activate for about an hour and a half, and then they would leave. So they had their own particular schedule, and if you wanted to see the piece, you had to pay attention to the birds. But my favorite thing about this exhibit, this piece, was that when it was gone, and the windows were put back up, it took about 2 weeks for the effect to fade away, because every day at 1 o'clock the pigeons would land. And there was a sort of ghost version of the piece that I think was really my favorite thing. If I were to do it again, I would just try to build the ghost version of the piece for people to appreciate it somehow, because there's something poetic in that, I think. Yeah, this is another. You could actually put some food in through that little slot to feed them. And these are all pigeon feathers, and this is a fan that would trigger when the pigeons would land on the fan, and it would blow the feathers. Feathers would hit the strings, and the strings sound would be picked up by a turntable tone arm that's on the record here. This is a Runoff Rainwater power turntable that I was thinking of installing in places with heavy rainfall, so that as the rain ran down the curb, runoff rainwater, it would spin these up and play these old acoustic 78s. And people could go out and program their own record player. All the neighbors, so when it would rain, music would play all over the city. I built this in Singapore for the metro stations. You could put this wheel against the armrest of the escalators and just use that free energy. Those things are spinning all day, and you could use them to play music just by tapping into it. Excuse me. The Headland Center for the Arts called me around 2006, and they invited me to do a project with Jim Denovin, who's an artist who does these incredible large-scale sand drawings. And and so I wanted to do something with the ocean. I've been dying to do something with something that was much more powerful than me, but I was also terrified of it. And I created this. I had this notion of doing an ocean-powered instrument, and they said, you have 3 weeks. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I ended up basically working day and night to build what I thought would be the best instrument for the ocean at the time. It ended up being about the size of a Volkswagen. And there was a huge water wheel here. It ran this series of pulleys and powered an offset cam that would power an accordion. These are salad bowl anemometers, which would spin in the ocean breeze and play 78s on this old handmade wooden turntable. And then there was a pump here that would pump air into a melodica that I could play as well. And we ended up throwing the whole thing in the ocean at Rodeo Beach, and it turned into quite a happening. People just jumped in the water and helped stabilize the craft, and I was sitting there and I realized, like, I'd never tested it. I just built it based on the assumptions I had in the bath, from being in the bath as a kid or just thinking about water. And when I put it in the ocean, I realized there is a lot of nothing going on when you're at the edge of the ocean. The wave will come in, and then it'll start to go back out, but there are huge silences and pauses. So I realized that was happening, and the instruments would sort of burble to life and then get quiet, and I would fill the pauses by playing clarinet or just listening, and people were trying to keep the craft from being tossed around, so it became a really nice event. And about, I don't know, maybe it's this wave here, but about 15 minutes into it, a wave came in and just ripped the water wheel off. And we ended up having to drag the thing out of the water, and somebody who was an amazing accordion player hopped onto the boat with me, and I played clarinet and he played accordion, and we had an impromptu concert on the beach. That gave me faith that if you have a particular idea, sometimes the world will open up just enough to make it happen. Because I couldn't carry this by myself. There was a lot about this that I couldn't do by myself, and I didn't know where the help was going to come from, but it just seemed to happen. So it taught me not necessarily to rely on that, but to have a little bit of faith that good ideas can the space can be made for them. And then I got a residency in Iceland, in the eastern part of Iceland, and the reason I was really interested in Iceland is because it's a really physical, intense place. It's in the middle of the Atlantic. It's getting ripped apart by a few centimeters every year, and it's also hugely literate. They have 100% literacy, and all their history is wrapped up in these epic sagas, these poems. And there's a saying in Iceland that 50% of Icelanders are authors, and the other 50% read their books. And there's also Björk and other storytellers and musicians. So I wanted to go into the lava fields, consult with volcanologists, go into the lava fields to places that might be inundated by lava if there were future eruptions, and do recordings of stories and music in those areas, and then press up these enormous, 12-foot negative molds of records, and then install them back in the landscape, so that 2 weeks or 200 years or 7 months or whenever there's another eruption, these sites would be inundated by lava, and it would cast itself into the shape of these records, so that months later you could go in after everything was cooled and excavate these boulders that would have the sound information inscribed in them, and then maybe put them on huge public hand-cranked turntables so that things would spin and you could hear what happened as a result. And that's just a notion of the islands helping to complete the story of the people that live on the island. So my residency gave me a chance to explore that and to start to sort of lay the groundwork for it. Yeah, how are we doing on time? Okay. So this is basically all has come out of a curiosity with what record players can do. I started with that one idea, the turntable, and tried to think laterally about what it could do. I didn't even actually try. I was compelled to. I think it's really important to follow what you're compelled to do rather than necessarily trying to be clever or trying to be original, because I think you can spend a lot of energy in the attempt to do something that feels like it's never been done before, and and it's unfortunate that the thing you really might be compelled to do and that you might really have a spark for, and that might inspire a lot of people, might get left by the wayside. So just as a cautionary tale, I think it's really important to follow the things you're compelled to do. As a result of following the turntable, I ended up spending a lot of time outside and noticing